J.R. Briggs. J.R., is that what I should call you today?
Yep, JR is what I've been called my whole life. That sounds great.
That just makes me think of Dallas, you know, the old TV show that I suspect many people watching this will be too young to remember. But
When I was younger, though, people did ask me, did your parents name you after the show? And I said, absolutely not. So.
Okay, great. So we're here today to talk about your new book, which is a book. I mean, there's a subtitle. Maybe you could share that and just explain a little bit about what the book's about. And I think it'll set the back nicely for what we want to talk about today.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, the book title is Fail, Finding Hope and Grace in the Midst of Ministry Failure. And it's addressing basically wanting to give pastors a safe place to talk about a dangerous message of failure, rejection, shame. We all think about it, have experienced it, or fear it. And so if we don't have those safe places to talk about it, it can lead to some very destructive patterns, and we can actually then inflict that on those that we're called and entrusted to lead. So basically it's developing a robust biblical theology of failure and also trying to develop a biblically accurate metric of success, or I like the word health better, of what does it look like? What are we after? Because how you define success defines you in whatever realm you're in, and that includes church. And so what is it that we're after? And it's really a book about grace for pastors and ministry leaders that think they know everything about grace, but we know it in our heads, but it may not actually be running through our bloodstream.
Yeah, I'm going to just pause there for right a moment. We'll get on to some of the other stuff in a minute, because I think that's absolutely critical. One of the things that I know my own pastor, has said to me a lot over the years is that when he speaks to pastors, and I've seen the same thing when I speak to pastors, it's actually quite shocking sometimes how can I put this? How functionally the gospel doesn't always really do its job in people. And, you know, he has a very simple way of explaining the gospel, involves drawing some pits and things. And this is all, it's, you know, part of the reason that led to our own book, actually. We've just written a book together called Hope Reborn, which is really a very basic gospel book. And we really mostly wrote it for people who are becoming a Christian. But one of the things that we wrote it for ourselves, but certainly as we've had conversations with other pastors, is that actually at root, some pastors go, oh, I've never quite seen it. I've never quite grasped it. Maybe they grasped it up here, but not down here. I remember a guy who was with us. He wasn't a pastor, but he had been through Bible college and come out the other side. And it was only after he'd been with us for a year or so. And funny enough, we had an old Pentecostal preacher, very sort of not the kind of guy that you would necessarily think this particular individual would have gelled with, but somehow listened to the guy as he sort of rammed the point home in sort of true Pentecostal style. Lit up for him, and he was like, I've never understood this before. I've never really heard it. And do you think that's a major sort of root of some of the problems then, just not having the gospel fully in our hearts?
Yes, absolutely. The irony in all of this is that the entrance exam to the Christian life is admitting we're failures. It's called confession, repentance. And yet, so many pastors are scared to death to talk about their failures, about their weaknesses, because they're so afraid that if they do so, they'll get whacked and heads will roll. And they live in that fear of saying, wait a second, it's about grace, but it's about grace for you all. And I'm wondering if you actually think that grace includes me as a pastor. And it's one of the lies that pastors can easily believe, that grace is for everyone except for me. And one of the dangerous things is to forget that pastors are people first in need of grace and pastors second. And so I fully agree with you. We have seen that. It's always emotional. We always see tears. And when we have these epic fail events, it crescendos at the very end to where we take communion together. And that time of communion is done very differently. But the Holy Spirit has been so evident and present, just this gentle kiss on the room of being present and seeing God show up. It's almost palpable. And people are saying, wow, I thought I knew this, or maybe I knew this, but I forgot it. And it's so great that it's now actually, it's making me free again. We're seeing lots of freedom happen in the midst of pastors talking about this dangerous, but very important message of failure.
Yeah, no, I think that's really good. So of course, one of the challenges that people have with this is that some people will hear what you've just said and go, "Oh, well, come on. What are you trying to say? Are you just saying that, we're all sinners and, there's no real victory, there's no real growth?" And there's a fine balance here. Because, on the one hand, as you say, well, my wife sometimes calls it perfect Christians. And they're never really perfect, but there's those Christians who like to put a facade on of perfection, and as you say, can't really accept their failures. But then you do have on the other side, where basically it's like, well, Jesus loves me anyway. I may as well do whatever I like, and secretly, perhaps a pastor is, addicted to pornography or worse, and all the time saying, well, I'm one of the Lord's anointed. It's absolutely fine. God has saved. And, what I do with my body doesn't really matter. My heart's in the right place with God. And, I serve God, so he understands my weakness. And, and I think sometimes people can go into one of two sides on that. Would you agree?
I would absolutely agree. In fact, there might even be another gutter that we need to avoid. And when we talk about epic fail events or the book on fail, people say, oh, is this just about glorifying failure? It's absolutely not glorifying failure. It's not sitting around, it's not a moan and groan session. Oh, I feel so badly. It's not I'm a victim. Hope you have pity on me kind of thing. So that's on one end. The other end this is not a chance to throw Band-Aids on deep wounds. These are not times to put $5 answers to $1 million questions. This is not what this is about. But you're right. It's not on the other end of saying, well, I'll just do whatever I want, the Bonhoeffer cheap grace concept. And so what we're trying to do is be very raw and real that some of these wounds hurt. And some of them are affairs, and some of them are financial or health issues. Some of them are, I got fired 19 years ago. I was never told why. Just got axed, and I just haven't let go of the hurt and the pain. And whatever it is, whether it's moral or amoral, there's all sorts of the list is endless on the types of failures. But we're needing to avoid those to make sure it's laser-like in its focus towards hope without sugarcoating it. And you're right, there are masks that are available all over the place for people to put on. I mean, back to Adam and Eve in the garden. But we have masks all around us that we put on, and pastors have all sorts of their own set of masks that are easily available to reach for. And we can be really good at wearing those masks so well that maybe even our spouses, our family members, our closest friends don't even know we're wearing them. And so in the book, I mentioned several of those masks that we reach for. But naming things has a way of changing things. And so we encourage people to name those masks and to talk with others about it. Say, this is a temptation for the idol of performancism rather than to reach for grace. And the moment we reach for performance or a mask is the moment that we put the cross down.
Very good. Now, you mentioned performance then. I'd like to come to that. So I think, though, it's quite interesting to sort of demarcate the different types of failure that you sort of hinted at there. There's obviously moral issues, and I think those are ones that that get you into the press sometimes. But sometimes that's the only thing that people focus on, isn't it? Well, I haven't slept with someone other than my wife, so I'm okay. And I think there can be a sort of over focus on those issues sometimes.
Yeah.
But then obviously you mentioned things like being fired. So those are issues which have happened to you, sometimes perhaps where you're a victim. But you also talk about performance, and I guess tied with that is this whole thing of putting someone on a pinnacle and putting expectations on somebody, and certainly that can be very hope destroying if people put expectations on you, and you yourself know you don't meet those expectations, and perhaps it's becoming increasingly common to your people that they don't. I love that line I read in the blurb about someone saying they'd grown their church from 120, I think it was, down to 50 or something, and so sometimes people can be in that kind of position and think, well, here am I'm at the pinnacle of these expectations that I'm putting on myself, that the people are putting on me, that the role puts on me, and I'm not able to meet them. So I think it's interesting to talk a little bit about that, because I guess that's an issue that's very hidden. I think the moral issues tend to come to the fore a bit more often, perhaps.
Sure, absolutely. You're right. And there are four main categories. And the first one, obviously, is a mighty fall, just in terms of an affair or embezzlement or some illegal activity. But sometimes it's a tragic event that happens. My wife gets cancer. My child's in a car accident. I find out my child is addicted to drugs. But there's a third one there, and it's a slow leak. Just this, again, growing a church from 150 down to 27 people, there's just this kind of slow downward spiral, and I'm just having the life sucked out of me. And then the last one, pastors who are burned out statistics, and they just can't take it anymore, and they're bitter and they're dry and they're upset and exhausted, and so they leave. But you're right, how we define success defines us, and so we have to be very clear, what is it that we're after in anything that we're doing, and especially the church. And unfortunately, I want to be really clear up front, first of all, and say I am not against big churches. I have served on staff of two very large churches, but what I want us to be aware of is the motivation behind the ambition to have a big church. And that's what needs to be addressed, and is largely gone unaddressed. But to have a big, successful church, we have to be very careful. What do we mean by that? Unfortunately, in the last few decades, we've stolen the success metric from the business world. To put it very crassly, some have called it the 3 Bs: buildings, bodies, budgets. And so therefore, you are a good ministry leader if you have a large building, if your budget is not only meeting expectation, but is larger, and bodies, your attendance is up, you're a growing church. You do those 3 things, you're going to be invited to speak at ministry conferences. You do those things that you're going to be put up by your denomination or in your diocese or in your district or area as being a successful pastor. If those 3 Bs are lower, you must be failing. And so while numbers, it's nuanced because some of those numbers can be helpful indicators. But where it gets very dangerous if those 3 things are the only way that we measure the health or the success of the church. And we never get to the idea of discipleship or of faithfulness or of fruitfulness. And unfortunately, I'm just not sure if Jesus would be invited, at least in North America, if Jesus would be invited to speak at a lot of ministry conferences today.
Well, and he didn't have a very big congregation by the end, did he?
No, not at all. And so we would look at him and say, look how inefficient he is. Look at these things. And yet we have to be really careful. I'm sorry?
Well, he had no building.
Yeah. Yep, absolutely. And he had large crowds, but near the end, most deserted him.
Yeah.
So,
the budget, well, that wasn't so great. And there was some embezzlement going on, but not by him, obviously, by really very good treasurer.
Yeah, absolutely. So what do we do with that? Yeah, what are we after? And so this idea of what is our new metric of health? Well, how do we measure up to what the kingdom is doing? Is our metric in our church of success or of health, does it match up with what we read about in the Gospels? We read about the kingdom. Does it reveal the heart of God? And so in the book, I talk about the key absolutely has to be faithfulness. We will never get to the end of our days, and Jesus will say to us, well done and good and successful servant. And so we have to realize that faithfulness is what he values in us. If we steward everything that's been entrusted to us, he also won't say to us, what did you do with what I didn't give you? No, why didn't you do what the guy down the street did? Why didn't you do what she did in ministry? And so we have to move on some of our values from product to process. That's a big one. Moving from numbers as the number one thing to stories. Moving from results as the highest priority to relationships, and moving from efficiency, which is a pretty high value in most North American churches, to congruence of story. Is the story of my life is it congruent with the story of the gospel? Is the story of our church consistent with the story of the kingdom of God? And congruence is a big word in God's economy in terms of how his metric of health is in our local congregation.
That's right. And I think, one of the challenges here is that some people will hear what you're saying, and they'll hear what you're not saying, and they'll go, oh, okay, So what JR's saying here is what we all need to do is just to be content with being small, and not really go after growth, really go after souls, in terms of salvation, and actually, if people leave us, that's a sign that we're really faithful. I mean, there are Christians who are like that, aren't they? The smaller the church is, the more faithful it is, Until, there was one actually quite well-known, well-respected writer who sadly ended his days living on an island and unable to fellowship with anyone. You just think, oh gosh, that's not how it's supposed to be. It's like there's an interesting balance to be had here. I think Rick Warren says it very interestingly. He says the church that's content not to be growing, I think he says, is or to be seeing souls saved, because of course seeing souls saved and growing aren't necessarily the same thing. It's basically saying to the world, we don't care if you go to hell. So how do you balance that thing with, you're absolutely right, this kind of idol of success where every pastor feels that they need to be the next, I don't know what name to say now, but the next, pinnacle guy who's got this big church, and if you don't succeed in having a large church, you've kind of failed. So how do you help people to navigate those two extremes? Because I've certainly seen people even pastors who are a little bit almost lazy and are content in their church, and really, you think, well, what are you actually doing? What are you achieving? And yet, so many others fall the other way. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And back to congruence of story, if we are reading the Gospels right, we don't see any laziness. And Luke 10:2 says that, God's looking for laborers, hard workers, backbreaking work in his field for his harvest. So that if we aren't doing those things to seek and to save the lost, I came to those who are not who are healthy, but those that are sick. If we aren't doing those things, then the story of our church is not congruent with the story that we read about of Jesus and of the kingdom. So that's the first thing. There is a metaphor that I use, two metaphors. The first one that I use in the book is if I go to the doctor and I go into the waiting room and I'm called back by the nurse, and she checks my height, my weight, and my blood pressure and my cholesterol and all that stuff, and she takes the numbers, and then she looks at me and says, okay, good, you can go home. And I say, wait, I haven't even seen the doctor. I'm sick. And she says, yeah, but your numbers check out well. You're okay. If we only take numbers as our evaluation, we're missing the point. But we take that as a basis, a foundation that actually then leads us into talking with the doctor. And then the doctor says, how are you doing? Stories. Tell me how you're feeling, right? So there's a relational side. Then he or she is relying on experience of training. And then they're picking up tools, and they're, tongue depressors and looking in my ears and my eyes and my throat and listening to my chest. And she says, yeah, I think you have bronchitis. So all of those things are used as evaluative tools of health, of making sure we're caring the most about the things that Jesus cares the most about. So that's the first one. The second one is people say, well, I want to be growing. We want to be growing. We want to have the right metric. We're just not. Why not? And I have two sons, and when our oldest son was about 3, every May, my wife likes to start the little garden out back, and she was tilling and getting things ready, and my 3-year-old wanted to go out and help her. And so I said, you can go help mommy for a little bit. And I pulled him in. After a little while, he took his nap. And after about an hour and a half or 2 hours, he woke up from his nap. And his first thought when he sat up, he said, so Daddy, are the vegetables ready yet? And I said, buddy, it doesn't work that way. And I had to explain how it takes weeks and weeks and watering and so on. And he was so disappointed. And it was in that moment, it was just a very clear moment of the Lord saying to me, don't you do that in ministry too, JR? You think that as soon as you start something, you're going to see immediate results and success. He said, I need you. Most of ministry is that faithful plodding that sometimes is pretty mundane, but I need to remain faithful and steward the plot of land, whether it's a big garden or a small garden. Even though I'm tempted to ask, are the vegetables ready yet? I really need to wait and trust in the Lord on that. So
that's very good. And I think maybe this is a good opportunity for us to move into something that I'm a little bit passionate about, and that is this whole notion of, for some people, church planting, it is very much starting a new plant. It's like putting a seed in the ground. It's a very, very slow process to start from the beginning. And I think you do see a lot of people who have this idea that, they've heard the story, of the mega church that starts in someone's lap and ends up in, multiple venues with thousands and thousands of people and sermons on the internet. And somewhere in their heart, they think that, first of all, that's going to happen for them. And second of all, what they've missed often is the story. People talk about that. I mean, the church I go to is reasonably large for the UK. Anyway. But the point is this: for 15 years, we didn't really grow above 100 people. We got to about 100 people about 15 years in. Looking back on that time, I was there from almost day one. It wasn't a wasted time. It was a time where much was going on under the surface, where a team was being built. I mean, the core leaders of our church are still now, most of whom, joined sometime in that first 5 or 10 years, really. It's like then at some point, when God was ready, he pressed the fast forward button and we did grow. But, if we were to go back to that early church, a lot of people looking on might have gone, well, that's a failure. You haven't grown. And I do think that a lot of pastors have that mentality, especially when they plant a church. It's like you're saying that, and actually so, there's this assumption that they're even called to lead a large church. Maybe they're not.
True. Yeah, I mean, looking at the life of Jeremiah, God said, I have not only a call on your life, I've had a call on your life before you were even born here. And oh yeah, by the way, everything that you touch is going to fail. In fact, you're going to be thrown in the stocks, you're going to be rejected, all these things happen. And Jeremiah said, what in the world? I'm doing what you've asked me to do. In fact, he goes on to say, God, you deceived me, and I was deceived. This is a harder call than, what are you doing? And yet God not only called him before he was born, and everything he did didn't work, and yet some of his contemporaries, everything that they touched seemed to be pretty successful, at least how we would evaluate success today. And yet one was faithful, and so was the other. And it's that faithfulness that we just, it's the parable of the talents, the 1, 2, and 5. And I love that though there are differences, 2 of the 3, Jesus says the same thing to them. Well done. What was given to you, you did what I asked you to do, I'm going to entrust you with more. And the one who didn't was angry because he didn't steward what was entrusted to him. And when we are constantly look at that church, well, look, I'm not as big as that. Well, it's just a joy killer. And discontentment in the kingdom is just not anything that's congruent with the story of Jesus.
Yeah. I think that's right. And so you have the 2 talent and the 5 talent in that story. And I think, if the 2 talent guy is going, well, it's not fair, I'm not a 5 talent guy. He would have ended up like I guess that one with the 1. It's like, I don't know if he knew how many talents the other had, but it's about making the best of what you are and knowing who you are. I think that's the critical thing. And I have to say, having seen a few people start churches that haven't worked, in some cases that maybe especially with the retrospect, you go, perhaps that person should never have actually been a planter. Perhaps that person shouldn't have bought into this model of the pyramid. I think that's one of the things that bothers me is who become Christians, and they think, well, I need to progress. I need to become a mature Christian. Oh, that's good. Okay. And then, well, now I'm a mature Christian. I really need to be a small group leader. And perhaps someone asks me to be a small group leader. That's great.
Yeah. Unfortunately, we've stolen the pastor.
That's enough. I want that.
Yeah.
Go on.
Yeah. You're exactly right. The pastor as CEO model, at least in North America, is quite dominant. And again, that's stolen from the business world and brought in. And I'm not sure we see this sort of command and conquer, top of the pyramid type thing throughout Scripture. In fact, it's a plurality of elders that we see throughout the New Testament. And that's the next book that I'm working on with InterVarsity Press that will be out in January, Eldership and the Mission of God, about that idea of shared, mutually submissive leadership as elders together pointing in the direction of God's mission. And so when that shared, mutually submissive, faith-filled, Jesus-oriented group of leaders are attempting to lead a church together, it's a beautiful expression of God's heart, even of how the Trinity operates in and of itself. And so we just have to be careful about the expectations, not only that the congregants can place on the pastor or what they desire in a pastor, where we really long for Saul when God really desires a David, kind of thing. And also to be making sure as ministry leaders, we're keeping our hearts in check too, about our own ambitions, being brutally honest and inviting others to be brutally honest about our motivations and our assumptions and about our masks. And it's that inward heart stuff that we have to go through, because if we don't handle that well now, when we fail, we will process that inappropriately. And when we don't handle that appropriately, we then take it out on the people that we lead. And unfortunately, ministry leaders can be really skilled shame manipulators, where we use shame at the expense of other people, and then we keep them under our control, saying this is a place about grace, but actually a place that's truly about legalism. And so sometimes that message becomes pretty inconsistent. Yeah, legalism. Yeah.
Well, I think that's really, really interesting and really good. And I think, see, this whole model, I worry a bit about this whole model of little churches by people, many of whom actually they're people. And I sometimes wonder whether, it's almost easier to get it right in a larger church, assuming you've got a healthy leadership team, where, somebody who might be a church planter otherwise might actually get ministry perhaps, or, serve on an eldership team where he's got brothers alongside him, or, preach occasionally rather than every week so it's not killing him, or, minister in the areas that they're actually gifted at rather than trying to be. See, large churches are becoming more and more prominent, and also why these multi-site churches seem to be a new thing. And broadly speaking, I tend to personally welcome that with some reservations. I've wondered how you feel about it.
About multi-site satellite campus?
Multi-site large church, the whole thing.
Yeah. I'm a fan of God unleashing new works among new people and new groups, and doing that in a very incarnational way. So I've seen God work in satellite campuses for sure, and satellite approaches. I have some significant reservations, however, and part of that being we preach a gospel about a Jesus who is incredibly incarnational, but then we encourage people to watch a screen as we tell them about how important incarnation is. Yes, it maximizes a good teacher in multiple ways, but do we know to the level, and I'm not sure, I'm just posing the question, do we know to the level that we're stunting the growth of people within that local congregation who could actually grow to use their gifts in communication or, some of those other things? I worry that we've elevated pastor as teacher and the teaching gift to a level that I'm not sure should be elevated to that prominence. And so we think of pastor as teacher. What if you have a great shepherd who just cares for people, loves people, is a great evangelist, but isn't a great teacher or isn't the teacher that people want? I think at least in North America, we have we want edutainment from our pastor as CEO, our good teaching, inspiring leader from up front. And so we just have to be very careful about that. A mentor of mine for the last 12, 15 years has been Eugene Peterson. And I don't think there's anybody who has articulated better in North America what it means in terms of faithful service in a local church than Eugene Peterson in all of his books. But he wrote a book called Working the Angles, and the introduction to that book is worth the price of the whole book, just the first 8 pages of that introduction. And I've gotten to spend some time with him, and I asked him point blank, I said, Eugene, what is the role of a pastor? And he said, the role of a pastor is to help people pay attention to God and respond appropriately. And in the midst of the complexity and the professionalism of ministry that sometimes creeps in, I love that definition because it lowers the boom of meeting people where they're at and journeying with them to where God wants them to be. Not where I want them to be, not where they want to be, not where the culture wants them to be, but where God wants them to be. And that's been an incredibly helpful definition that Eugene has given me, and has kind of beaten that in my head in the most appropriate of ways. And so I think if we're helping people do that, whether it's big or small, that's great. But I have concerns that the potential, the logistics and the model, the structure of satellite campuses, especially with the video screen piping in, that it may actually hinder gifts being used in those local congregations.
Yeah, I guess it depends how it's done, I suppose. That's the point, isn't it? Because many churches that do that will have a sort of a site pastor, and that site pastor will at least preach some of the time, and actually for some of the other guys, they don't preach every week, but exercise that gift they do have, and they can focus more on the sort of thing you're talking about. So if it's done well, I guess it can work really well. If it's done badly, then it can just turn everyone into a passive audience.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it can be done well. I think the hard work of really getting to the root of our motivation, why are we doing this? And if we can answer the why on that, and it's pointed in the direction of mission and being faithful, I can see God using it. I absolutely can. I think people assume the why, and I've worked on 2 megachurch staffs that had video satellite campuses, so I've seen the good, the bad, and the ugly that comes with that. This isn't theory. This is, real stories and people in my mind as I'm talking here. And so it can be helpful, but if you don't answer that why, it can be very, very dangerous in the long run, whether people in the pew know it or not.
Yeah, no, sure. And, what you were saying about turning the church into a business model is a big concern. One of the things I've always been a little worried about with pastors is this notion of a pastor as an employee of the church, and so there's a board that seeks and hires someone, and it seems to me that often in that hiring process there's not a real degree of, the Bible talks about testing. I almost have this feeling that someone's in the congregation, has been there for a while and emerges as a leader as a more natural kind of biblical thing. It's fascinating that, when Paul and Timothy sort of started the church, they didn't even appoint pastors at first. They left them and then they came back, and it's like, okay, so who's emerged? It's the sort of impression you get. But maybe this is my own sort of ecclesiological biases coming out here. But I have a bit of an issue, if I'm honest, when I look at American Christianity, although I do see it over here a bit as well, with this idea that, you hire a pastor, and a pastor, for that matter, sees the church as a bit of a career to something else, as opposed to this idea of emerging from the body. Do you have any thoughts about that?
I do. I am just as concerned as you are about that very thing. And I think it gets back to thinking of it as church as a spiritual or religious business. And it concerns me greatly. And again, this mostly comes from Eugene Peterson. But if I may, and there's a quote that Eugene shares that I think is exactly on this, and I'd love to share this. And it actually is in the book, but I have printed this out from one of his books. I'm forgetting which one that it's from. It might be from Working the Angles. I think it is in that introduction. And this is what he says, and I think it hits on what you're saying. But I agree, this is a problem in American culture in our churches. He says American pastors are abandoning their posts left and right at an alarming rate. They're not leaving their churches and getting other jobs. Congregations still pay them, and their names are still on the church stationery. They continue to appear in the pulpits on Sundays, but they're abandoning their posts, their calling. The pastors of America have metamorphosed into a company of shopkeepers, and the shops they keep are churches. They are preoccupied with shopkeepers' concerns, how to keep the customers happy, how to lure customers away from the competitors down the street, how to package the goods so that the customers will lay out more and more money. Some of them are really good shopkeepers. They attract a lot of customers, pull in great sums of money, develop a splendid reputation, yet it's still shopkeeping. Religious shopkeeping to be sure, but shopkeeping all the same. The marketing strategies of the fast food franchises occupy the waking minds of these entrepreneurs. While asleep, they dream of the kind of success that will get them the attention of journalists. And it's these last few sentences that nail me. He says, the biblical fact is there are no successful churches. There are instead communities of sinners gathered before God week after week in towns and villages all over the world. The Holy Spirit gathers them and does his work in them. In these communities of sinners, one of the sinners is called pastor and is given the designated responsibility in the community. That responsibility is to keep the community attentive to God. And then this very damning sentence he says, and it is this responsibility that is being abandoned in spades. I think that addresses what you're talking about, Adrian.
Yeah, that's a great quote. You know what would be great is if I could get that quote for the blog, actually, if you've got
Sure.
that electronically. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, I'd be glad to send that to you. Sure.
Thank you. I can share that then on the page. But
Yeah.
that's just a great. I think it's so true because we forget what it's all about. And this whole business model rather than a relational model. I mean, isn't the church meant to be a family, not a business?
Yeah. And that's one of the metaphors we see. And we talk about that metaphor at our church. If we're not acting like a family reunion when we gather together, we're probably not doing this right. And as far as church sizes, we have to remember that most of the early churches, they fit in living rooms. These were 30 or 40, churches, Thessalonica and Colossae and Philippi, these are 30, 40 people. So they were operating like an extended family. And so it'd be interesting if Paul were to visit some of the churches in North America and even in the UK. I think he'd be shocked by the amount of churches and the sizes that they are, and saying, why are you not meeting in smaller? I don't know. And I'm not advocating one way or the other. I think God uses all sorts. But I also wonder if Paul were to visit my church or your church or any of their churches, what letter would he write to our church if he visited us? And so that's a question we ask regularly, wondering, are we remaining faithful? Is the tip of the arrow nice and sharp and pointing in the direction of the mission in the heart of God?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. And I mean, it's interesting when you look in Acts, they did sometimes gather in Solomon's colonnade, large numbers, it sounds like, but they also gathered from house to house, and so I do think it's a both and sometimes. I think, to have a sort of celebration, even if it's not every week, is a good thing. You can catch something of the bigness of God, the majesty of God. You can worship together. You can be addressed by a great preacher. But I like what Eddie Leo says as well. And he says that, that actually people do make decisions to change in a large context like that sometimes. But
Sure.
The real change in that context.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, the structure of our church is we have...
Or even better.
Yeah, I'm sorry. There's actually, in our church, we actually do that every other week. We actually meet as a large gathering, our whole church. But the opposite weeks, we meet in geographically based smaller settings in living rooms. We call them house churches. They can be called a variety of things. And so we have this big, small, big, small, big, small rhythm. So we're not sure if we're one church or if we're a series of a bunch of small churches that come together every other week for some sort of central time of worship and teaching and encouragement and storytelling together. But we do that very thing because of looking at how the early church met, of Solomon's colonnade all together and then in from house to house. We do that quite literally in our settings, which is a little bit crazy, and people look at us and say, why would you do that? And sometimes it is a little clunky, but it does allow us to pay attention to God and respond appropriately in a way that's most helpful in our particular context here, which is on the north side of Philadelphia.
So that's just really great. And we've talked a bit really systemically. I wonder what you would say to people watching this who are themselves pastors and they are themselves sitting on a failure and trying to figure out what to do about it.
Yeah, part of this comes from my own experience, our epic fail events, and then also the book itself. I had to wrestle with, I thought my biggest fear in life was failure. And then I realized actually my biggest fear in life was rejection that happens when I've failed. And then I realized I was wrong. That wasn't my deepest failure or my deepest fear. My deepest fear is shame that happens after I've been rejected when failure has occurred. And so I had to do that deep drilling, and I had to do that hard internal work, and actually sat with a Christian counselor who helped me untangle the Christmas lights of my identity, which were tangled around what I did and how well I did it or how well I did not do it. And as a result, I had to really say, do I believe that line that God spoke to Paul when he says, my grace is sufficient for you? I really had to ask, do I believe it's sufficient or not? And it was a several-year process, and truthfully, I'm still working through that myself. And so part of the book was a process of really getting to the root of what is it about shame? Where does the gospel address shame? Am I always stuck in this failure, rejection, shame continuum? Or where does the gospel intercept or interrupt that failure, rejection, shame continuum, that process? And I realized the gospel doesn't keep us from failing. In fact, Jesus says, don't be shocked when it happens, you should expect it. But what does it look like in the renewing of my mind that even when that happens, others may reject me, but what does it mean for the God of the universe to still see me? Instead of rejection, there's acceptance available, and I'm invited into that as a child of the kingdom. Instead of shame, there's honor. What does that mean? In most Western civilization, Western mindsets, we think much more about guilt, innocence. You know, are you wrong or are you right, or who's to blame? But in the Eastern context, it's much more about shame and honor, which are relational terms. And we see that in the Psalms. Certainly we see in Romans, it's kind of this guilt, innocence thing, but there's a lot of honor, shame talk that exists. Do not let me be put to shame. May I be honored. And in relationship with God, what does it look like for me to move from shame and to go through that process of moving in the direction of seeing myself and believing in every fiber of my being that I am a redeemed, loved child of the King. And man, when pastors get that, it sets them on fire. And I've had glimpses of that, and I want more of that in my own life. But the true freedom, as Ken Davis says, is when I have nothing to hide, nothing to lose, and nothing to prove. And I think when we understand the gospel and it gets in the bloodstream of everybody, especially pastors, including pastors, then we are actually able to live in that freedom where I can live in such a way I have nothing to hide, lose, or prove. And I think that's a great definition of freedom that Paul is talking about in the book of Galatians.
Really helpful. I guess I've got one other question, really, and that is this. What about people who are not pastors? Maybe they're sort of, in some kind of leadership role in the church. I mean, I'd be one of those. I serve on the leadership team of our church, but I'm not employed there, and I'm not one of the pastors, but I am, quite close to the pastors. And I've got some thoughts of my own about this, but I'd be interested to hear your thoughts about how people like that, who probably, they do have some sort of ministry role in the church, perhaps, but they're not pastors, how they can best support their pastors to hopefully, I prevent them being failures, or if there is failure there, that will make it a bit less painful for them.
Yeah. The statistics on pastors is haunting and harrowing, and so pastors are at risk. We're all at risk, but pastors have bullseyes on them. And I think just knowing some of the statistics, knowing some of the difficulties, people joke all the time, oh, pastors only work one day a week, right? And we laugh along as pastors, but deep down, we say, if you only really knew, man, I'd love to just be able to not have to work what feels like 9 days a week. And we're never off. And so we're not looking for pity, but I think what we need is the expectation where we can be a person first and a pastor second. And sometimes we forget that. And so churches that do this really well in terms of supporting their pastor, they actually require rest, Sabbath taking, vacation, and counseling. And they say to them, look, you're not screwed up, but you are screwed up. You're a sinner. You're a human. And so we're going to put in your account X amount of money in the budget, and you need to use that for counseling. And the only thing we're going to ask you is, did you use the money or not? Even just once a month, allowing your pastor to just put in the line item of the budget every year that a pastor can see a Christian counselor to make sure his or her heart is okay, and to be able to then process that and live out a healthy life, requiring vacation be taken, requiring Sabbath, a 24-hour ceasefire time where they are not allowed to be doing anything other than praying and playing resting and being. And I have yet to meet a pastor. Well, let me say this. I have met many burned out pastors, and when I ask them, tell me about your Sabbath, they've said, I've never had one. I think there's a huge connection between pastors who burn out and those that don't practice Sabbath religiously, no pun intended. So I'd add that, also knowing the statistics again on how pastors are at risk. But I think evaluating very bluntly, especially if you're part of the leadership council yourself, Adrian, of evaluating what is our expectation of health, or what is our metric of success, and does that match up with congruence of story with what the kingdom of God is about and what we read about in the scriptures. And the other one is just extending grace, having patience. I know one guy, he just had an awful day, and at the end of the day, he was so fried, and he went into a conversation where someone said something that just tweaked him, and he just kind of reacted in a way that was poor, and that parishioner left the church because of that. And he said, I'm sorry, I've had a rough day, it's no excuse, I shouldn't have done that. I said, well, you're a pastor, you know you're not supposed to, you shouldn't have done that. And he walked away. He was so grieved because he said, I have rough days, just like you have rough days, except when I have a rough day, you hold it against me, and you get to see that. And sometimes people really take that of not allowing their pastor to, it's not an excuse for sin, it's not an excuse for immaturity, but of saying, be patient with your pastor, pray for your pastor. There's no greater gift you can give to your pastor than not saying, oh, I'll pray for you in a passing statement, but I will commit very regularly, make a time commitment to pray for you as a part of the rhythm of our family. And most pastors are afraid that they will get fired, at least in the North American context. And so creating a safe space where they can talk openly about how they're really feeling will eliminate the need or the desire on their part to want to reach for a mask.
That's good. And what about, you mentioned a little bit there about churches needing to understand, the role of the pastor, the vocational call of the pastor, and what they're really meant to do. Do you think that a lot of the failure of pastoral ministry, especially I'm now thinking of statistics, the thousands that are leaving every month, those that are falling into immorality, those that are losing their faith in some cases, or those that just, as you say, get disillusioned and burnt out. Do you think that some of that is really the fault of the congregation, not having the right education and the right understanding, and not doing something?
Yeah, great question. I think part of it comes in with the Eugene Peterson quote that because we live in such a consumeristic world and a culture that says I get it my way, when I want it, how I want it, and this preferential treatment, therefore I want a charismatic leader up front who's a great teacher. He or she demands my attention. There's charisma there. He or she is funny, whatever it may be. And so, yeah, I do think a poor understanding of pastoral vocation is at fault. However, I will answer it this way too. The role the pastor plays is also in making sure there is training and teaching and guidance of what an appropriate expectation is of the whole church, of which every part and every person has a part to play, including the pastor. And so I think teaching on that and leading the elders or the leaders and the person in the pew to say, this is what we're after as a church, and truthfully, here's what we're not going to be after. I will unapologetically commit to doing these things for you as your pastor, helping you pay attention to God and respond appropriately and fleshing it out in these ways. But I will unapologetically not do these things. This will not be a part of what I do. And I may disappoint you, and you may leave because of it. But I am not called to do these particular things of entertaining you or, whatever it may be. So I think it's a bit of a symbiotic relationship of making sure the congregation realizes their expectations are in check, while at the same time making sure the pastor and the leaders of that church are teaching and guiding on what appropriate expectations of everyone and every role in the church has.
Well, that's really very helpful. If someone's watching and get hold of not just get hold of like such like need some help. What's the best way to reach?
I'm sorry, you were breaking up just a little bit. Could you repeat that?
So the question, obviously there's the book and people can get hold of the book and read the book. That's great. But what if someone feels that they need a little bit more help than that? You mentioned epic fail events. How can someone best tap into the resources that you and the people around you offer?
Yeah. In the second to last chapter of the book, I talk about restorative practices, and I think that would be something that would be good to check out. Some of those are very specific ways of receiving help. Some of them are more general. Some of them are practical. Some of them are very spiritual. Not do these 17 things and you'll live a successful life. That's not what this is about. But it's more about picking a few of those as training wheels to say if this can help us move in the direction of a more robust understanding of a metric of health and faithfulness in the kingdom. So I would recommend that, certainly the book. I also would recommend reading two authors. I've mentioned Eugene Peterson. The other one would be Henry Nouwen, and Henry Nouwen's book, In the Name of Jesus, I have to read about every 6 months because I forget the messages in there about every 5.5. And it's so good about digging down deep into those three temptations that are always there, the temptations to be relevant, to be spectacular, and to be powerful. And those are all there. Satan tried to tempt Jesus with those in the temptations when he was in the wilderness. And I think those resources right there are incredibly helpful. This may seem a little blunt, but if you're in that vulnerable state of feeling like a failure or wrestling with failure, I would avoid any ministry conferences or ministry books that have a veiled attempt to promote success. I would stay away from those right now because that could be very difficult.
Right. Okay. But your Epic Fail conference, is that something that happens regularly that people can come out to as well? How do those work?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you can log epicfailevents.com. It's different than epicfail.com. That's a completely different website. But epicfailevents.com is a way to find out about it. We actually used to have it where people came to us at a central location, but when you're dealing with a lot of pastors who struggle with failure, many of that financial, they can't always afford to fly to where we are and attend a conference. And so what we do is we actually wait until there's a community or there's a city or there's a region that wants something like this until we're invited. We don't go on a speaking tour. We don't go around the country with a tour list. We wait until we're invited, until there's a hunger there to say, you know what, there are other pastors in my community or my region that really want to wrestle with this. And even in England, if there are any in the UK that would be interested in having us come, we'd certainly be more than willing to talk about that. But we wait till we're invited. And so if there are others saying, man, we got to talk about this together, I tell them I'm there and I'm going to get on a plane after 2 or 3 days and I'm going to fly back home, but you all are going to be here. And I hope all this is the start of a conversation together that facilitates connection so that you all continue to meet. And the Epic Fail events we've hosted in the past, people have continued to connect in those cities and meet regularly. And we challenge them at the end, pick 1 or 2 pastors that you've connected with in this event and try to connect with them for lunch or coffee once a month for the next few months to process more of this idea of failure, rejection, and shame and where the gospel comes into that. So others are doing discussion groups, reading the book, and then processing that together with other pastors that they may know, either online or around the country.
Yeah, well, that's really good. So it sounds like, read the book, go to the event maybe. Building those, you can be things. And where I hope someone is not overly impressed with your press or overly impressed with how you're doing, how well you're doing, how not so well you're doing, but loves you as a person, I think that's like what Jesus said, go into all the world and make disciples, employees, or customers.
Right.
Would that be a reasonable?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
That's a great place for us to stop. Is there anything you'd just like to say in closing, perhaps to...
Yeah, well, this is this whole conversation is not necessarily about failure and success as much as it is about an invitation to grace and about a challenge for faithfulness. And so friends of mine have said to me, now that you've written a book on it, use epic fail conferences and events, Jared, when I think about fail and failure, I immediately think of you. And I say, I'm fine with that as long as your second thought is about grace and about God, because that's all this is. And we cannot, grace is just a theoretical construct until failure exists. Whether it's sin in my life, whether it's conflict, frustration, I can't extend grace to someone unless there's some sort of point of failure or conflict or sin that exists. And so it reveals opportunities for grace to break in and break through. And so can we avoid it? No, we live in a broken world, but it's how we respond to that grace that is the litmus test of how much we actually believe in grace and how much our church actually embraces that grace too. So as long as we remember, if we start and the first thought is failure, that's great. I hope the second thought is always grace and the goodness of God and what he's done through the person of Jesus.
Well, thank you very much for joining us for this web chat, JR, and thank you for those of you listening, both live and to the recording. And we trust that this will have been a great help to you. There'll be more chats from time to time on patheos.com. You can read more about the book Fail at the patheos.com book site, or the book club, shall we say. And my name's Adrian Warnock, and I've been talking to JR Briggs. Thank you for being with us.